difficulty supplying over the next few years, notably in the context of rare metals. Do you anticipate any difficulty on that level?
Well, let's start with the rare metals issue, because that's a boogeyman that keeps being drawn out. There's nothing about rare earth metals that are rare. They're a byproduct of any number of mining processes. The problem is turning the ore, which is very abundant. Some of them are more abundant than copper, turning them into a finished metal. It's environmentally sketchy, but it's not a new technology. It dates back to the 1920s. So to think that the United States can't pick up on that is kind of dubious. In addition, after the Chinese did their first geopolitical scare with rare earth a decade ago, a lot of processing capacity has built out in places like France and Australia and Malaysia and Texas. So if the Chinese flipped the switch today and said that no one else can ever get any rare earths from us ever again, all that stuff would spin up, and in less than 6 months we'd be okay. And most producers have more than 6 months of inventory. So that's not something I worry about at all. Semiconductors more broadly, there's 3 general categories. You got the really high-end things you use for like servers and spacecraft and high-end computers. Second, you got the mid-range that you're going to use for like your average computer. And then at the low end, you got the ones that like, you have a smart blender. So, you're standing there using your blender and it chimes your phone when it's done. Doesn't really add to your life, but that's what we call the Internet of Things. Honestly, in my opinion, the most overhyped trend that we've seen culturally in the United States in quite some time, but hey, people seem to like smart spatulas, so whatever. Okay, those are made in different places. So the low-end stuff is all China, the mid-end stuff is Malaysia and Thailand, the high-end stuff is Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, and the United States. The designs for almost all of them come from 3 places: Germany, the United States, and Japan. So we know how to do it. We know how to do the best of it. We've just outsourced it. Now, in the case of the Koreans and the Taiwanese, they have easily spent over $1.5 trillion over the last 20 years building out this fab capacity with subsidies. So to think that this is a fair state-to-state competition, it is not. They wouldn't have happened without the subsidies. So honestly, for the high-end stuff, China is not the problem. And for the low-end stuff, I would challenge whether we really need that at all. Now, building out a fab facility is not something that you can do overnight, so the few years time frame that you floated is probably the right frame to think about this. But a couple of things. Number one, the high-end silicon quartz that forms the basis of semiconductors, 80% of it comes from North Carolina. So in the semiconductor war, if it comes to that, we have resource control. So yeah, I don't worry about that either. And then of course we have the technical capacity to expand the industrial footprint in the United States to take advantage of what we know and at the money that we've got. In that, we're already under development. We probably need 12 fabs in this country. I think we've got 3 that are under construction right now that start next year. So the process has started. But again, the high-end stuff comes from countries we broadly trust. And because we're Americans and we only want the best, that's what we're going after. So if you want a smart spatula, you might be in trouble. Because I don't think that the United States is going to get into the low-end semiconductor fab. But if you're concerned about iPhones and computers, well, let me rephrase that. If you're worried about smartphones and computers, we're going to be fine. If you're worried about iPhones, there may be a problem. Because while every American firm in the last 2 years has seen the writing on the wall and has looked for alternative suppliers to China, Apple is the only major company that's gone the other direction. They've quadrupled down on the Chinese supply chain system. So when this all breaks, and I'm pretty sure it will, we're not going to have new iPhones for a while, but Samsung's pretty good too.
I would agree with that assessment. That being said, all of the countries that you mentioned for the middle and high-end stuff, all of them are fairly close to the Chinese sphere of influence. You don't believe this poses any problem?
I wouldn't say it's a walk in the park, but from a security point of view, the Chinese have never been able to push past the first island chain and integrate with the rest of the world ever, with the exception of now under the global order. So honestly, if the United States really wants to destroy the PRC, all it has to do is go home. As for the countries on the periphery, the further south you go, the safer they are. There's jungles and mountains separating the Chinese from the Thais, for example, and there's no period in Chinese history where the Chinese have ever been able to influence the countries to the south. And if they try to go east, they immediately end into a conflict with the Japanese, who have a better navy. Can a lot of things go wrong? Oh, totally. I do not mean to dissuade anyone from thinking about what a war in the Pacific would look like. It's a good preparation, if nothing else. But there's nothing that is built in that part of the world that can't be built in the United States and Mexico. The only thing that the Mexicans cannot do is semiconductors. And that's because it's a precision education system that they just don't have. But any other sort of manufacturing, we have long known, about 3 years running now, that if you have an industrial plant in North America and an industrial plant in East Asia, the industrial plant in North America can make the products quicker, at a lower price and at a higher quality point that you can in East Asia, because the inputs are cheaper here, the energy is cheaper here, the labor force is more productive per unit of output, and the Mexicans have really come into their own as a middle manufacturer.
Well, that sort of solves the problem for the United States and North America on the whole. There's a system of alliances, the European countries notably, who have to deal with or would have to deal with any potential fallout from a semiconductor shortage.
Ugly. Yeah, no, the Europeans lack the differentiated labor force that is necessary to even attempt semiconductors. So even if you could say that the Germans can design chips, which they can, I really doubt that they can run a fab. Electronics and computing require a labor force that is both high-skilled, medium-skilled, and then also has some low-skilled stuff for assembly. And one of the European obsessions with income inequality has achieved a lot of great social gains. They're much closer together than we are here in the United States. But that means their labor force isn't differentiated. And you're just not going to pay somebody to do a 10 nanometer chip the same that you're going to pay somebody to snap together an iPhone case. Labor costs means that if any of these products were to be built in Europe, they'd have a price point 4 and 5 times of what we're used to here in the United States.
To switch topics up a little bit, I want to get to the notion of the end of history and how it sort of took on a life of its own, having captured public imagination in the United States. Do you feel that the decisions, because of that sentiment, that the decisions have been made over the past 30 years that were ultimately inevitable? Did you view that foreign policy sort of circled back on itself based on American public opinion?
Well, I'm definitely not going to lay the fault for the shape of the world right now at Fukuyama's feet. No, that's not fair. But you've got to look at it from the average American point of view. With the global order in the 40s, we told the world that geography no longer matters. We will defend everyone. Everyone can play in the global economy. Everyone can be part of any supply chain with any partner. Doesn't matter if your country is a geographic and mountainous mess. You can play. And that policy is what allowed countries like Korea to exist in the modern age. And they're now, one of the 5 richest countries in the world in terms of their technological acumen. That could not have happened without the global structures that we put into place. So from 1945 to 1990, we told the world that geography no longer matters. 1990 came along and the Cold War ended. And after more than a generation of geography not mattering, now we said that security is all taken care of, because compared to how it had been, it was done. So the mindset of the average American and some of the subtle texts of Fukuyama built on that because it was true. But when Herbert Walker Bush left, the management went away. And the old rules of the world from before World War II started to slowly reassert. Now they're back in full blast. So we didn't have anyone at the top who meaningfully updated the marching orders for the diplomatic and the military corps throughout the entirety of the post-Cold War era. We might